Alright, so it's been a while since I've done anything on this car, and even longer since I've posted anything to YouTube. But now I finally got a chance to work on it, getting back at it, and I got some big changes for it that I'm really excited about. The biggest change for this iteration of the build is this Nexus R3. And all the goodies to rewire the entire engine and transmission harness. The only original wiring left in the car is going to be the lights and wipers and stuff like that. So I've got all the stuff I need to redo it. Big box of goodies from ProWire. I've never ordered from ProWire before, but I'm definitely going to in the future. Everything kitted out like this. Their curated list of connectors makes it really easy to order everything I need for this project. Including heat shrink labels and the clear shrink to protect the heat shrink labels, and boots for the connectors. I am starting with Haltech's universal wire-in harness for the R3. They've done a lot of the legwork, like splitting out sensor grounds and 5-volt power, 12-volt power to go to most of the outputs and inputs. And it'll be a good starting point. Plus, every single wire is striped and a different color, so if I had to buy 8 feet of every different color and stripe of wire, that'd be pretty expensive. So this is a good start. I'm going to be heavily modifying it because I am running Deutsch bulkhead connectors, one for the engine, one for the intake manifold. I got a bunch of new sensors for the car, pressure and temperature at least. Crank and cam are still stock. This is a Rife IAT sensor and a low dollar motorsports map sensor. I'm not very brand loyal. And treated myself to a few new tools for the project, including a heat shrink thermal label printer so that I can make my own labels for this, make it look all nice and professional. Also have the cheapest rope I could find for routing the harness. It is a good approximation of the size and bend radius of some of these cable bundles, and plenty of caffeine for the project. I've done a lot of pre-planning for this harness already on my computer and diagrammed all these out with a tool called WireViz. There are some shortcomings to WireViz, but I think all in all it's a really good tool for getting all this stuff into a clear format. The images look a lot better on the computer rather than printed out, but if I don't have access to the computer, these will work in a pinch. Here's the current state of the inside of the car. See the factory wiring mess that's left. A lot of these wires will be thinned down because the stock cluster is no longer going to function now that I'm ditching the stock ECM entirely, or the LS ECM entirely. A lot of the other wiring was for the boost controller that I was running, the AMS 1000, and the smooth stage box trans brake relay here. That will be run directly off the high current outputs on the R3 now. And then a lot of this wiring was just where I gave up on it and just zip tied it all up, and here it sits. I'll still be using that 6-circuit fuse panel and ground bus bar. I cut out a new ECM mount on the plasma table, and I'll be mounting it to the dash bar about here. I'll have to peel the carpet back so I can weld it in. Factory dash shell is going back in, and hopefully one day I'll be able to make that cluster functional again, but for now I really don't know what I'm going to do for gauges. Alright, I got the bracket welded on. Standing on my head to finish out them welds. Now that I've got the ECM mounted, it's time to start putting this wiring harness in, which I need to modify for my own purposes. They do a really good job at setting up a default configuration for this wiring harness with some of the inputs and outputs broken off to stay in the cabin, and a nice firewall grommet, and the rest of the stuff broken out outside of in the engine bay. But a couple of the outputs, which would be better served doing other things, like for me, my trans brake is going to be on one of these, are taken up for the injectors and the ignition coils. And I want to reclaim those because I can run the injectors and coils off of a fuse. I'm also going to be using one of the half bridge outputs for my torque converter clutch, and by default Haltech has them run into the power for the CAN bus, and the other one is broken out through the rest of the harness for the outputs and the crank and cam signal. So I will be taking back one of the extra half bridge outputs for my torque converter clutch. And of course, since I'll be running bulkhead connectors, most of this harness is going to be cut off and used to build the engine harness and the intake harness. Now that I've unwrapped the harness and I can see what's going on in here with all the splices and stuff, it's time to cut the harness, every wire for the intake and engine harnesses, leaving the stuff that's going to stay in the chassis. Got my rope here. I've got it zip tied off about where I want to cut it. And now for the fun part. Alright, so I got the engine and intake harness branches broken out of the main harness, and now it's time to start terminating the intake harness. For the most part, these are the finished bulkhead connectors. What's left is a couple of external wires for the injectors power, and the ignition power, which is going to be split over two different pins for current capacity through these small pins. I went back and forth on this for a little bit, but eventually I decided to pull all these 5 volt power, 12 volt power, and sensor ground wires out. The reason being is that there's just way more wires than I need. So I depinned these at the ECM and pulled them out of the harness, and I'll add them back in one at a time. I've tried to explain a couple times why I want to reclaim some of these two half bridge outputs and the high current outputs, and it just turns into a big ramble session. But anyway, with the high current outputs and the half bridge outputs, you can do things like PWM and soft start and set current limits for devices and retry circuits if they overcurrent. And that's good for some things, but if there's a device that just needs to have power when the key is on, I don't want to burn up one of them ECM outputs for that. I'd rather use them for devices that need PWM or, soft start. So that's why I'm moving the CAN power to a fuse. All Haltech CAN devices are powered over the CAN network. So that's why they dedicate one of these 8 amp half bridge outputs just to the CAN network. So I don't have any CAN devices yet, but I might at some point in the future. So I'm just going to wire this to a fuse, so it'll just be on when the key is on. That's all that's needed. Same with the injectors, they just need 12 volts when the key is on. And that's why I'm not using the PDM type outputs off the Haltech for those devices. So this half bridge HBO5 on the Haltech is split out, I think, like 12 different ways, and I need one of these wires. So I didn't want to leave this massive splice in the harness for just one wire, so that's why I pulled this out. I did leave one of the sensor ground splices in. I just clipped the wire that fed this one off real close here, and that's all that's left. Oh, the battery ground, which is basically just used for shielded wire, the shield on these multi-conductor cables. I left that in. I pulled out the 3 extra wires, but this will be used to shield the wires on the other side of the bulkhead plug. Alright, so I'm starting to add the wires back in that I just pulled out earlier, and I wanted to go through one of these in real time. This is the wire for my torque converter clutch. So it's going to run from the Haltech connectors through the engine bulkhead. So I got my ECM pin here, my open barrel crimper, and just like that, there's the ECM side of things. This one goes to connector A25, pin 25, which is one of Haltech's half bridge outputs. These super seal connectors are real simple to work with. You just pop the retainer and click the wire in, being careful not to pull any of the other wires out. At this point they're all released. It takes some effort to pull out, but don't want to jostle them too much. And then clip the retainer back in place. There's the wire added to the ECM connector. just the length right here. Strip it back about 3/16 of an inch. And here's the Deutsch pin. And there's the bulkhead side. According to my diagram, I want this one to be in pin 28. On the face of the connector, every pin is labeled. So as it's coming through, I can look and verify that it's in the right pin. And there it is. Now I'm going to finish adding the sensor power and ground back into the harness, just way fewer of them than I took out earlier. Now that I've got the engine and intake harness bulkheads finished, it's time to figure out the rest of the circuits in the chassis harness. I've used my rope, snaked it through the engine or through the interior and around to the firewall grommet that I'm going to be using, and throughout the engine bay, just roughly outlining where the branch points will be and what devices will end up where. So now that I have my template, I'm going to pull it back out and start bundling the harness together where all the branch points are. Some of these wires are going to be longer than what came in the Haltech harness, so I'm going to have to replace them. Well, after a little bit of work with Kapton tape, here's where I'm at now. The intake bulkhead is done. The engine bulkhead is done. All of the branches to the chassis harness are finished. These wires will terminate at the fuse block. That entire fuse block is set up to be key on power. So when that comes live, we will have power to turn the ECM on, power to the boost solenoids, the line lock. This other wire goes straight past the fuse panel to the shifter button. Power for the coils, injectors, and power for the CAN bus. Continuing on, we break out to the rear of the car here. This is fuel pump relay trigger wires, flex fuel, and the steering wheel buttons. And the rest of this goes through the firewall grommet to the rest of the engine bay. Boost solenoids, dome pressure sensor, fuel pressure sensor, the other ends of the two wires for the line lock, and fan and water pump, both power and ground here. So that's where I'm going to end this video off. I have yet to sheath it, put the braided sleeving on, but I'm not going to do that until I'm sure that I haven't missed anything. And yeah, maybe I'll make a video on doing the engine and intake harnesses, but it'll just be a lot more, probably be a lot more time lapse, same as this one was. Once you've seen one crimp terminal made, you've probably seen them all. Alright, so if you made it this far, thanks for watching. I came to the realization a couple days ago that the only reason I really want to do this is because I sort of missed the old forum build threads, and I kind of wanted to, I guess, use YouTube as a way to recreate that. So if you're following along with my build or what I'm doing with the car, thanks, I appreciate that, and we'll see you on the next video. Hopefully it'll be sooner than the last one was.